Wonderful. So I'm going to now turn this over to Beth. Beth, thank you so much for joining us today. For those of you who don't know, Beth Jordan is at Child Trends, and she and I work together regularly both to make sure that the partnership members know what is coming and what might be useful to their work, and so that I can share with her the things that members want and that Child Trends might want to think about doing some work on. She's been a fabulous partner to work with, and I'm delighted to have this opportunity to offer this webinar on population measures of school readiness. As I said before we started the recording, school readiness really involves looking at everything about children's well-being, and so a population-level measure of that is a fabulous tool for the partnership network because our members really work on everything and anything that matters to kids and to getting them ready for school and ready for adult life. So this is exactly the kind of tool that we're always looking for. Beth, can you start us off, please? You may be muted. Use *7.
Debbie, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Please.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. So thanks, Debbie, so much for hosting this webinar and for inviting us to speak today. It's great to see such a good, strong turnout, and we are so excited about this work, and we're just thrilled to have the chance to share it with you and to share it with your network. So thank you. As Debbie said, my name is Beth Jordan. I'm the Director of Policy Communications and Outreach at Child Trends, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar. We'll be sharing some early work to develop a pilot measure of young children who are healthy and ready to learn. Once the measure is fully developed and validated, this will be a measure of school readiness for 3 to 5-year-olds at the national level, and over time it will be available at the state level as well. This measure is really the brainchild of the Federal Maternal and Child Health Bureau, NCHB, and Child Trends has had the good fortune to be working with them on developing this measure and now on refining it and validating it. All of this work has been overseen by an expert panel that includes several leaders in the child health and early childhood fields. And I know you may be wondering why we are so excited and so interested in sharing this information now about a measure that's still only a pilot that still is being refined and in need of validation. So we're sharing it now because we need the input from all of you, from other early childhood leaders, to make this measure just as robust and useful as possible. So we're hoping that today can be the beginning of a discussion with all of you and across the field to help you as you're planning your work and thinking about it over time to make sure that you've got this in the back of your brain and realize it's coming your way and this work is being done. So I want to first give just a high-level overview of our time together. We're excited to have Jessie Berlin from the Maternal and Child Health Bureau. She's going to be sharing the origins of this work and plans for it moving forward. Then we'll hear from Chris Anderson-Moore, who leads the team of researchers here at Child Trends who are working with Jessie and her team. Chris also co-chairs the expert panel with Michael Kogan of MCHB. And finally, we've got Catherine Tout, who's a co-director of Child Trends' early childhood group, to share her perspective, which has really been informed by years of working closely with states and communities and federal agencies. And I imagine many of you on the phone are familiar with Catherine and her work. We're also happy to welcome Katie Pascal from Child Trends and Reem Gandor from HRSA, who've both been really working on this measure from its inception. And Katie and Reem are also going to be chiming in as we go along as they have thoughts to add. We'll be moving through the presentation at a pretty quick pace to make sure that we have time for questions and comments and reactions from all of you. And Debbie walked us all through how to raise hands and to type those into the Q&A. So we're really looking forward to your thoughts and your feedback and any questions you have as we go along. But before I shift over to Jessie, I just want to ground us in a little bit of context around this issue. So this measure is really a landmark step forward as researchers, stakeholders, advocates, policymakers have all been trying to answer this question of how are young children doing? And the field, the early childhood field and the child health field has needed this type of annual population level data for some time. there are a couple of things I want to highlight for you now before we go into the presentations about what makes this effort particularly unique. It's embedded in an annual national health survey, and I think annual and national are some really important words here. This will provide us with data every year so we can see over time how things are changing, and it's going to include data from young children across the whole country. It focuses on younger children, so 3 to 5-year-olds, and Jesse and Chris are going to talk about this more, but it really gives us this window into the school readiness of young children, which is quite unique. Eventually we'll be having state data that are comparable across states, and since all of you work at the state level, you are cheering as you hear this. I know that you value the importance of that as well. And finally, and certainly not least, is that the data is free and it's accessible and available to everyone. So just a huge benefit to the field. I think it's just important to also remind folks that this is a pilot effort, so there's much work that needs to be done. Here's just a brief overview, and again, Jesse and Chris are going to unpack these for all of you more, but as you're thinking about what a pilot measure means and what further work needs to be done, we'll be looking at the validity of the data, looking at those 3-year-old population especially, how the state data from this instrument fits in with state readiness assessments. And I know that's a question we've grappled with a lot, and we've heard questions from the field around, and you all may have questions today around this. How is this different from my state KEA assessment? Also the applicability of this instrument for community use. We know so much work is happening at community levels, and many of you are working with communities as well, figuring out how we'll be able to use this with communities too. And you all know just as well as I do how much energy there is around early childhood in the field. CCDBG expansion, preschool development grants, expansion of Head Start and early Head Start, all of the work that many of you are involved with in your state and in your communities, and philanthropic efforts, the money that's been fueled into helping young children be ready to learn. We're just so hopeful and excited that this measure can help you and help others in the field continue to make that case for investment and support of young children and their families. So with that little bit of context in mind, I am happy to turn the slides over to Jesse.
Great, thank you, Beth. Can everyone hear me?
We can hear you, Jesse.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. Hi, I'm Jessie Bierlin. I'm with the Maternal and Child Health Bureau, and I am working to support Dr. Reem Gandora on the Healthy and Ready to Learn initiative. Today I'm just going to briefly share some information on the impetus and the history of advancing this effort from the Maternal and Child Health Bureau's perspective. And so to start, I'll just say that at NCHB, and for those of you on the call, we know that the educational success of young children is shaped by a multitude of factors, many of which occur before entering kindergarten. And because children start to develop these skills during their first years of life, we hope that being able to identify children early who may be struggling to progress is important to help target efforts to promote their positive outcomes. Also at NCHB, it's our hope that having these aggregate measures of young children's health and development will be able to help our own grantees, but also educators, healthcare professionals, communities, and states to provide needed supports for children and families. So I want to provide a little bit of context for the National Survey of Children's Health. Both the National Survey of Children's Health and the National Survey of Children with Special Healthcare Needs were each fielded every 4 years beginning in 2001 on a rotating schedule. Initially, they were fielded by the CDC, National Center for Health Statistics, as a telephone survey, and are now fielded by the Census Bureau as an address-based survey with responses both by mail and web, and the respondent to the survey is the child's parent or caregiver. Beginning in 2016, the surveys were combined and are now fielded annually. And the survey produces both national and state level estimates for children ages 0 to 17. The survey is designed to collect information on the health and well-being of children, but also related healthcare, family, and community level factors that can influence health. So, for example, child and family health behaviors, healthcare utilization, and neighborhood amenities and resources. As Beth mentioned, all of the data is fully accessible. It can be downloaded at no cost. And we are proud to say that this is the largest annual survey of children's health in the U.S. Some of the key uses of the National Survey of Children's Health are listed on this slide. So the data from the survey do populate 18 of the Title V NSCH block grant program national outcome measures and national performance measures, and they are used by that program for completing their needs assessments. Both the national and state level estimates for multiple aspects of children's health are used to inform state and federal program and policy development. And as I mentioned, as the data is publicly available, it does support independent scientific research. And data from the survey does also help to track 15 healthy people objectives. You can see on this slide some more details about the 2016 survey. A note that data from 2016 and 2017 are combinable to support more detailed analyses of small subgroups. We released data from 2017 on October 1st, and the 2018 survey is currently in the field. And we did want to note that we do collaborate with several other federal agencies on content for the survey. Currently, 3 other federal agencies are sponsoring items. So to provide you with a little bit of the timeline and major activities for Healthy and Ready to Learn, I'll first start off by saying that the impetus to add content around school readiness to our redesigned survey was driven by both state-level stakeholders as well as experts from around the country. So specifically, at the same time as the redesign of the national survey, the Title V block grant program also undertook a significant revision of its national performance and outcome measures. Among the new national outcome measures developed in 2014 was percent of children meeting the criteria developed for school readiness, or Healthy and Ready to Learn as we're calling it. The initial process of identifying items to represent Healthy and Ready to Learn was guided by the work of the National School Readiness Indicators Initiative. And with this foundation, a final panel of items were selected for inclusion and refined through several processes between 2012 and 2015, which you can see here. They included ongoing consultation with experts, researchers, and federal partners. They included performing cognitive and usability tests, as well as a national pretest conducted in 2015. And in 2016, this work all culminated with the final panel of items, 22 items added with a total of 25 throughout the survey. And we do want to note that the selection and the development of the content areas and the related items was really an iterative process. In the absence of a gold standard for measuring Healthy and Ready to Learn, we adopted an approach that emphasized the potential of this new content and really an expectation that it would continue to evolve over time. So continuing on, items for the 2017 survey were refined and revised based on preliminary analyses of the 2016 data. 11 new items were added for 2018 based on expert input. Additional testing of the entire survey was undertaken. This summer in 2018, we awarded a contract to perform validation of the items, which you'll hear more about. Major work of the contract will include engaging stakeholders to evaluate the utility of the existing survey content, performing validation of the survey items, and developing recommendations for additional revision and refinement. And as was mentioned, we have convened an expert panel to provide input on the work of this contract, as well as overall guidance on the measure and its use in the future. Members of this panel, co-chaired by Dr. Kogan and Dr. Chris Moore, are federal agencies, funders, nonprofits, research organizations, and several of our state-level grantees. We did also recently publish a manuscript in Child Indicators Research that does provide more information on the methodology of the measure development. And just before concluding, again, we want to emphasize that we truly see this as a pilot measure and as the beginning of an exploration of what it means to be healthy and ready to learn. We truly welcome your thoughts and ideas on the use of this measure, as well as ways to continue to refine it moving forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jessie. This is Chris Moore, and we're thrilled to partner with NS-CSHCN on this important project. ChildTrends has focused for decades on strengthening the availability of indicators to monitor child well-being, first at the national level and increasingly at the state level. The National Survey of Children's Health has been a critical source of state-level information, and I'm sure many of you know this. But as noted, a measure of healthy and ready to learn with data from the early childhood years before children start kindergarten has been lacking. Developing such a measure for state policymakers represents a major addition to the stock of indicators for young children. As such, it is not a measure that predicts whether a single child is healthy and ready to learn. Rather, it is a population-level measure that can be used by state policymakers and advocates who seek to understand and monitor the development of preschoolers in their state. As others have said, this is a pilot measure, and it is an ongoing process as new data become available and as validation work proceeds. And next, as promised, is a deeper dive into the process of developing a population measure of healthy and ready to learn. As Jessie noted, ChildTrends work with NS-CSHCN to develop a pilot measure was conducted in 4 steps. The first step was to examine each individual survey item. Second, we analyzed survey items to identify domains. Third, we developed scales for each domain on a common metric. And fourth, based on these scales, we developed an overall index of healthy and ready to learn. We began by assessing individually each of the 25 survey items that might potentially be a part of the measure of healthy and ready to learn for 3 to 5-year-olds, item by item. As you could imagine, each item in a large national survey is expensive, so it is important to know which items are essential and effective. Specifically, we wanted to assess whether there was a distribution in how parents responded, whether parents would not or could not answer the items, and whether the items were extremely lopsided, that is, items where many or most respondents selected the same response category. Well, not surprisingly, parents tended to rate their children on the positive end of each item. In fact, 2 items were so lopsided they had to be dropped from consideration in the subsequent factor analyses. For example, nearly all parents described their preschooler as affectionate and tender. Importantly, though, there was very little missing data. Across the items, fewer than 4% had missing data. We then looked to see how each item was associated with child age and with parent education. We expected to see age differences and differences in competencies by parent education. This type of analysis begins to tell us if the items are valid. Do they measure what they were intended to measure? And encouragingly, we saw the expected age differences in children's skills and competencies as described by each item. And we also found differences according to parents' education. For example, 5-year-olds were able to count to higher numbers and were more likely to be able to identify shapes than 3-year-olds. Similarly, children with better educated parents were more likely to have these competencies. Next, in step 2, we examined the survey items remaining after step 1 to see how they hang together in domains of healthy and ready to learn. We'll show the items later. Right now I want to share what we did to identify the domains. As Jessie noted, we started with the 5 domains of readiness identified in the National School Readiness Indicators Initiative. They are shown here. Specifically, we assessed whether the 20 items sort into these 5 domains or whether they sort into other domains. This is called confirmatory factor analysis, and I want to acknowledge my colleague, Dr. Kelly Murphy, for her superlative work on these factor analyses. The goal was to assess whether these available items measure underlying factors that represent whether a child is healthy and on track to succeed in kindergarten. We found, in fact, that the items are best represented by 4 domains, as shown above: early learning skills, social and emotional development, physical well-being and motor development, and self-regulation. I should note that the language for these domains is evolving. like the domains themselves, and could change as work proceeds. As I mentioned, we tried to replicate the 5 domains, but we found that the items assessing language development and early literacy and cognition and general knowledge were very highly related, indicating that they represented a single domain of early learning skills. The next 2 slides share the items that fell into each of these 4 domains. 7 items fell into the domain of early learning skills. The child recognizes the beginning sound of a word, recognizes letters of the alphabet, rhymes words, explains things clearly, how high the child can count, the child writes his or her name, and the child identifies basic shapes. The self-regulation domain contains 4 items. The child keeps working until finished, child follows directions, is easily distracted, and sits still. The social emotional domain also has 4 items. Child shows concern, bounces back quickly, has difficulty making or keeping friends, and plays well with others. As mentioned, the domain of physical well-being and motor development only had 3 items, and several additional survey items are being sought. The 3 items so far are: child grips a pencil in their fist or fingers, or does not use a pencil. Condition of teeth, and this ranges from excellent to poor, and health status, again, ranging from excellent to poor. Well, step 3. One of the wonderful things about this work for me is that it embodies a whole child perspective. That is, it recognizes that readiness for school encompasses social, emotional, health, and cognitive competencies. Accordingly, the next task was to take the items in each of the 4 domains and turn them into scales on a common metric, and this is step 3. As you all know, children's competencies vary by age, so we wanted to address age differences in our coding. That is, while one might expect a 5-year-old to be able to count to 50, we didn't want to say that a 3-year-old who cannot count to 50 is off track. Accordingly, we developed developmentally appropriate cutoffs for each item, taking into account the different response categories used for varied items. So for each item, for children age 3, age 4, and age 5, we defined particular scores as at risk, needs support, or on track. These decisions were reviewed and discussed with HRSA and other researchers who were not on the project. Once we developed cutoffs for each survey item, we assigned codes. At-risk codes were coded as 0, need support responses were coded as 1, and on-track responses were coded as 2. This means that for a scale with 7 items, scores could range from 0 to 14. A score of 0 means the child got a 0 on all 7 items, while 14 means the child got a 2 on all 7 items. On a scale with 4 items, scores could range from 0 to 8, where 8 means the child received a 2 on all 4 items. Well, having done this, we then had 4 scales, but they had different numbers of items. In order to develop an overall summary measure, we needed to put them on the same metric. To do this, we coded scores for each scale using the same labels that we used to code the survey items: on track, needs support, and at risk. Here, on track is defined as having a top score on all of the items with room for falling short on 1 or 2 items. At risk is coded when a child did not even receive a score of 1 on all the items. And the middle group, needs support, is comprised of children scoring in between on track and at-risk groups. Okay, what did we find? This slide reports the proportion of children coded as falling into each of these groups on each of the 4 domains. In blue are the children scoring on track, in green are children in the needs support group, and in orange are the much smaller proportions coded as at risk. You can see that the majority of children are scored as on track in each of the 4 domains. 59% for early learning skills on the left, 78% for self-regulation, 82% for social-emotional development, and 86% for physical health and motor skills. Rather few scored as at risk, 9%, 3%, 2%, and 2%. And modest proportions scored as need support, 33%, 19%, 16%, and 12%. Personally, I think it is very valuable to have indices for these separate domains because each domain is important and contributes to children's development and readiness. However, we also wanted to have an index that reflects the whole child perspective. How are children doing across these 4 domains? Accordingly, we sought to translate the 4 scales into an overall summary index, and we chose a very straightforward approach. We chose to summarize for each child the number of domains in which they scored as on track, need support, or at risk. Now, these data can be presented in many ways. The following figure is one. It summarizes the number of domains in which children aged 3 to 5 are on track. Our pilot measure, shown here, summarizes the number of domains in which children were described as being on track in all 4 domains, 3 domains, 2 domains, or 0 to 1 domains. When we look at readiness across all 4 domains, we find that 42% of all children score as on track across the 4 domains. Another 34% were coded as on track in 3 of the domains, while 15% were coded as on track in just 2 domains. Finally, 9% were coded as on track in 0 or only 1 domain. So this is the first ever population level measure for preschoolers of healthy and ready to learn. Having said that, it is a pilot measure and not the last word. So we want to share some of the next steps that are getting underway. Fortunately, HRSA-MCHB is very aware of the need for replication and validation, and a competitive award has been made to Child Trends and our partner MyATech to continue this work. We all recognize that the best way to test the predictive value of this measure is to do a longitudinal study so we can see whether preschoolers who do well on this measure actually do succeed in school. Of course, longitudinal studies take time and money to get up and running. The design work should ideally begin soon so that a survey is ready to go when the measure is finalized. I hope that this idea is on someone's drawing board because I think it would be an invaluable contribution to the early childhood field. At the moment, we are fortunate to have funding from HRSA-MCHB and the Foundation to begin work on next steps to confirm that this measure is based on the right items, the right scales, and the right overall index. Expert review is a critical first activity. An initial meeting was held in 2017, and the second expert meeting is actually planned for this afternoon. And your expert review is, of course, one of the goals of this webinar today. We hope that you will ask questions and provide input both today and in the coming weeks. Next is stakeholder engagement. The HRSA-MCHB project will support engagement with stakeholders at the state level to identify how they conceptualize readiness, the measures they are using, how they're obtaining data, and their interest in the pilot measure for use in their state. The statistical validation work will assess the stability of the scales for each domain overall and across gender, race, ethnicity, and age subgroups, using new data recently released for the National Survey of Children's Health for 2017. Well, I was privileged to be a part of the original design team for the National Survey of Children's Health from 2001 to the present. The goal has consistently been to design a survey that would produce useful, actionable information for states and for the federal government. This pilot measure of healthy and ready to learn is the latest example of the National Survey of Children's Health serving just that purpose. I'm excited to be able to continue contributing to its development. Now I will turn over the mic to Dr. Catherine Tout for comments.
Thanks so much, Chris. Hi, everyone. I'm Catherine Tout from Child Trends, and I'm really honored to be able to be part of the webinar today with Chris and Beth, Jesse, Katie, and Reem, and to share my perspective on this groundbreaking new work. And as I reflected on the promise of this measure, I thought of 3 ways that the work can impact the early childhood field. And you'll hear these themes and they'll sound familiar because each of our speakers have made these points today, but they're important enough to say again. So first and foremost, this measure, the Healthy and Ready to Learn National Outcome Measure, fills a gap in our understanding of children's developmental skills in the years before they enter school. We know that we've mentioned the kindergarten entry assessments, which examine children's skills at kindergarten, but this measure helps us understand where they are before they get to kindergarten. And as Chris said, it provides a whole child perspective. It also uses parent reports, which is unique. Our kindergarten entry assessments use teacher reports. By using parent reports of children's skills, we get a snapshot of their development across the domains that are important for school readiness. And we think this early portrait can complement the ongoing work that states and school districts, communities are doing to understand children's developmental status at kindergarten entry. But importantly, it can also help us understand what supports we need to put in place for the very young children, those children under 3, to help them be on a positive trajectory as they age into the years before school. So secondly, this measure, the Healthy and Ready to Learn Outcome Measure, provides an opportunity to better understand disparities among children and when and how disparities are emerging on school readiness. We know that states and local communities have prioritized equity in their early childhood initiatives, and a critical step is accessing data that can tell the story for policymakers and program developers. So this measure can be examined to identify whether and how these developmental skills are differing across children by factors such as race and ethnicity, language, and family income. And when we disaggregate data in this way, we can set equity targets at the state level. And then finally, as Beth mentioned, we know we're experiencing this unprecedented period of investment in early childhood at the federal, state, and community levels. With the expansion in CCDBG, focus on birth to 5 and the new preschool development grant funding opportunity, and so many early childhood initiatives in communities across the country, it will really be critical to track this Healthy and Ready to Learn national outcome measure over time. We will have to be patient, as everyone has said, because this is a pilot measure, and so we need to take these important steps to further test and refine the measure. But we know we now have the potential to track these trends over time to help states understand the progress that's being made in supporting young children. So I hope you share my excitement about the promise, the potential of this work we're discussing today. We think this can inform efforts to improve the systems, that infrastructure that can support young children and their families, but ultimately also to support the programs and the services that will bolster children's school readiness. And bringing us back to the whole child perspective, we know these essential supports are not only in early care and education programs, but these are also in health care and in initiatives to strengthen parenting and family resources. So this really helps us think across that full range of services that provide supports for young children. So please stay tuned for updates on this important work. I know we're looking forward to your input, so I'll turn it back over to Deb.
Great. Thank you so much. So let me start by saying that we're going to take technical questions first, questions about how it was actually designed, and what it means, anything about their next steps, all of that kind of thing now. You can enter your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom left of your screen. You do it by typing underneath the open box, which shows some of the messages I've been sending out. And then below that, there's a gray bar with a down arrow. You click on that down arrow and select either broadcast all or co-presenters, your choice, and send us the message. And then I will read the question out loud for our presenters. We do have a question, but before I read you that, I just want to mention that Kelly sent me a note just saying that she likes that the overall index is on a spectrum and not binary, whereas some state KERs are binary. So our first question is from James, and James says, this is very exciting. In Illinois, we are piloting the Early Development Instrument, EDI, that is a population measure that observes kindergarten students. It measures 5 domains and 16 subdomains. I am wondering if there has been any consideration of aligning data from 0 to 5 to the kindergarten instruments. And I'm going to suggest that we start with Chris, because I suspect Chris knows as much as anybody about where the overall perspective and next steps are on this project.
Yes, we've certainly thought about the EDI quite a bit. I mean, they're very different measures in the sense that the EDI is a teacher report measure at kindergarten, but the longitudinal study that I mentioned, which not yet funded, but we are hopeful, but a study like that could measure both of those and align the information from them or see whether or not the Healthy and Ready to Learn measure by parent report predicts to the EDI when kids get to kindergarten. So that's very much top of mind. Thank you for sharing.
So before any other, well, first of all, do any other presenters want to add to what Chris said? Okay.
This is Catherine. Sorry, I was just getting myself off mute.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that question, and I love the idea as it was written there to align data from 0 to 5. So I know we don't have a lot of measures in that 0 to 3 range, but that's a really exciting possibility, and there are some groups that are working on this both in the U.S. and internationally. So I think it's a really important point to make that we continue to think about how to do this alignment and then use that, as Chris mentioned, as a way to test the validity of these measures.
So I will add that I got a note from one of our meeting participants who said she'd love to continue a conversation with you about this. She's the Associate Director of the Early Development Instrument in Illinois, the population measure that James was talking about, I think. Anyway, the population measure that takes a holistic view of health and well-being in kindergarten readiness. So if you guys are interested after the webinar, let me know. I've got her email, and I will send it to you, and you guys can have a separate conversation.
Yes, we're very much, one of the things we're doing is interacting with people at the state level to learn what they're doing and what their thoughts are about this process.
Great. I will send you Jacqueline's email after the recording. Do other people have technical comments or questions about this? I'm going to just give you a minute to put in your comments. And while we do that, the next step after this is that I'm going to ask you guys a couple of questions, and you can respond one of two ways. You can write a note in the chat box, or you can raise your hand, and I'll call on you, and then you can unmute yourself using *7 and have more of a conversation with the speakers. But before we go to that, we do have another question from the audience, and this is from Titus in Massachusetts. Given the diversity of home languages, what languages besides English were tested in the pilot?
This is Reem. I can take this one. The survey is conducted in English and Spanish, and it's available in both languages. There were previous iterations of the national surveys of children's health and children with special health care needs that were conducted in other four Asian languages, but those constituted less than 1% of the returns that we got in. So now we field the survey in English and Spanish.
Okay, great. If you have another technical question, go ahead and enter it in the chat box. But in the meantime, here's a question I have for everybody in the audience. Does this measure fill a gap you see in your state? And how could having this data support your work? In other words, how would you use this? What would this be helpful for in your state? So as I said, you can either type in an answer in the chat box, or you can raise your hand up at the top of the screen, also on the left, and I'll call on you and you can unmute your phone. It's your choice. But we really would like to know whether this fills a gap in your states and how that data could support your work in the states. And while we're waiting for people to answer on that, I'm going to add another question. Well, actually, let's give people a moment on that. I'm going to ask a question of the presenters while we do that. My question is, as I think some of you know, we have members that range from very big states, New York, California, where they might want to be able to use this tool on a sub-state level, to very small states where it's often hard to get a statistically significant sample. And I'm wondering whether you can produce responses for all 50 states on the one hand, and whether it might be possible in some of the bigger states to use the data from the survey to give sub-state responses for, say, New York City or Los Angeles.
This is Reem. I'll go ahead and take the first crack at this. I think this is a great question, and it's one that we get frequently about the survey. In answer to the first part of your question about whether or not we can produce estimates for all states, we can. So that piece of the puzzle hopefully addresses some of the needs that are out there. To your second question about sub-state estimates, unfortunately that's not something we can do. It's not the way that the survey is sampled at this point, and in order to do that we'd have to make some very significant changes to our sampling strategy, which could potentially create some issues with how we produce state-level estimates, which we do have to produce. So I think it's something that this need for sub-state estimates is something that we hear often. It's not something that we're discounting, and it's certainly a conversation that we keep having with the Census Bureau that fields the survey for us, but it's not something that we can take on in the short term.
Okay, thank you. We do have a response to the first question that we asked everybody, and this is from Courtney King in Arizona. Our Early Childhood Development and Health Board, and then she says FTF, but I'm not sure what the initials stand for, publishes a biannual needs and assessment report. The data could be used for this purpose. It could also be used as we develop programming and strategies to assist families with children ages 0 to 5 in their state. So that's an answer to your first question, and if you have questions back for Courtney, why don't you go ahead and ask them, and I'll unmute her phone. Otherwise, we'll move on to the second question.
Well, this is Chris, and I'd like to mention one other asset that I see about this survey, which is that the data are collected annually. There's about approximately 6 months when the data are collected, and then they're released in a quite prompt manner. But as the years go by, states will have data that allow them to monitor over time, and for at least within a state, you might be able to do analyses for smaller subgroups using data across time, because the methodology is the same over years, so you can, in the future, you'll be able to combine data across time.
So that's actually, I'm going to follow up with a question on that. Is this going to be able to produce measures over time so that you can see whether your state is doing better or worse? And, you know, as I recall, and I think you said earlier, it's annually, the data comes out annually at this point, right? Are you going to be able to, can people use this to track how kids are doing over time in their state and do annual reports around it, much the way that they do with the annual Kids Count data report to show whether their state's made improvements or they're slipping?
Yes, and I believe the data are used in many of the Kids Count reports. Reem or Jesse might want to follow up on this.
Yes, Chris, you're right. So that's actually one of the benefits of being annual, is that you can certainly have a cross-sectional look at how kids are doing in your state or across the nation over time. Now, of course, there will be, some indicators if they're, if we have a very small sample, for example, you might have to pool 2 years at a time, but you could certainly look at an estimate for 2016 and 2017 and then compare it to 2018, 2019. So, yes, part of the goal of going to an annual survey was that we really would be able to provide states and users across the country that option to really track progress over time.
Great. So I do have another question for the audience, and I'm going to read it out, and then while you're answering that, I'm also, members of the audience are answering that, I do have another question for the folks who are giving the presentation. and this is a question from Child Trends staff, but I'm going to add a modifier. Their question is, are you or someone at your organization currently collecting data on 3 or 4-year-olds, and or if they're kindergarten ready, or if you're not collecting data, they want to know if your kindergarten readiness work includes children ages 3 to 5. So I think it would be helpful to them to know how many of you are working on kindergarten readiness work, focusing on kids age 3 to 5, and you can just shoot me a note in the chat box. But I also think if you're not the ones collecting data, and I know most partnership members usually are not the ones collecting data, is there another organization in your state that is collecting that kind of data that you know of at the state level? So if you guys can, you can certainly raise your hand if you want to comment on it, and I'll call on you, or you can type an answer in the chat box. But we are interested both in your work on kindergarten readiness for kids ages 3 to 5 and whether you or someone in your state is collecting the data. And while people are typing that question, I have a question for our presenters. And my question for the presenters is frankly looking pretty far down the road, but I still think it's worth raising. Given the ability to use this to track outcomes annually and to see whether states are making improvements, are you planning to, when the tool is ready to be used, to do annual releases of the report that people coordinate with and highlight their state outcomes at the state level?
I think this is probably a question for HRSA MCHB.
I'm sorry, I wasn't totally sure on what you just asked. Can you repeat that one more time? This is Reem.
So I know this is not ready for prime time, but when it is, are you going to do annual releases of the data by state, something that state advocates could then use to elevate the issues around school readiness and what the particular needs are in their state to get kids ready for school?
Yes. Okay. So that's an interesting question. I think that ultimately the answer is yes. When we've all kind of reached consensus that we have a solid measure. I think as Jessie probably alluded to in her intro, we really went down this path because states had an interest in tracking this over time. So it is currently an outcome measure for the Title V programs across the nation. And so ultimately this is something we would be putting out for states every year. And they would be watching their progress over time, to pick up on the last question. But I do think we need some more time and the results of the validation work and certainly input from the field, with folks who are on the phone as well as our experts, to make sure that we've really got that summary measure as close to right as it can be.
Got it. So we do have one response to the second question, and this is from Heidi Walton in Arizona. And she says that they do this now at the kindergarten level with a pilot project, but they don't have a statewide yet. So far I have not gotten other responses from folks. We really would appreciate getting your information on whether you're working on data collection around kindergarten readiness or someone else in your state is. I certainly know that many of you do more general kindergarten readiness efforts and can in fact share that data with Child Trends later, but are you doing any data collection on this, or are folks in your states? And Heidi from Arizona tells us the State Department of Education is doing the data collection with data collected from a selection of school districts. So we also have a comment from Massachusetts. Massachusetts does not have a statewide KEA or annual reports of readiness, though our state has recently endorsed the ASQ, and that will be used more and more in the field. Some local communities use their own KEAs chosen locally, and this is not my specialty, but I'm pretty sure KEAs means kindergarten early assessments or readiness assessments, but if I'm wrong, somebody should correct me. Does anyone else have a comment on what's happening in your state? Virginia says they do have a statewide assessment of kindergarten readiness that most school districts participate in. And I'm going to give people a moment or two more to respond. But I'm guessing that these tools are things that are done in the schools as opposed to population level measurements. I'm wondering, is anybody else trying to produce a population level measure like this measure? We now have long silences while we wait for people to respond. I'm going to ask the presenters, do you have another question for the audience that you want to pose at this point? We are just getting responses from a bunch of states now. So Beth from Virginia says Virginia is already piloting a new assessment, is also piloting a new assessment that includes a social emotional component via checklist. Hawaii does not have a KEA. In the past, we had a teacher report survey answered at the classroom level. For example, what percentage of kids in your class do whatever. And then from Illinois, James tells us Illinois has just published their first kindergarten readiness report. So, presenters, do you have another question for the folks on the line?
Hey, Debbie, this isn't a question. This is Beth again, though. And before we hit our time, I just want to make sure that folks know that there are ways to get in touch with us if they do think of answers or want to contribute to this conversation. A PDF went around with with the invitation, and Debbie, I'll make sure that you have it and can send it out to your network as well, just with an overview of information about the measure. And it also has an email address where folks can send any thoughts that they have or questions or comments. And for folks in the webinar too, you're more than welcome. Debbie knows my contact information well, so you're welcome to reach us that way also. We're also planning to have what we call a Child Trends 5, which is basically a 5 things to know about a certain topic. We'll have one on the National Survey of Children's Health that will come out later this month. And we'll also be releasing a blog later this month that has information on the measure and next steps for folks. So, if you're interested in engaging more, or there are folks in your state who you think maybe have information to contribute, there'll be resources that you can send along to them as well. And the last thing I'd note is we're planning to do a webinar again next week, and this is a broader, open to the public type webinar next Wednesday, which is December 12th at 3. I'll make sure Debbie has that info for all of you, but if there are folks in your state or in communities that you think would be interested and would like to hear more about it, we'd love to have them. We know we won't be able to have as much of a conversation with that type of webinar, but we still want to keep the conversation open just as much as possible.
Great. Well, it looks like we've gotten all the answers from states that were likely to get on the webinar. I do very much want to thank all of the presenters that we did today, and thank all of you on the phone and on the computer for joining us. I hope this was helpful. I'm going to send out the recording for anyone who wants to share it with colleagues, and the slide deck and the PDF that Beth just mentioned. And if anyone wants to be connected with Beth, I am happy to do that. I'm really excited by this. I think it will fuel child advocacy, not just in the early care arena, but around a wide range of kids' issues that all feed into getting kids ready for school. So this is a tool we'll try to keep you all apprised of going forward. But anyone who registered for the webinar and any partnership member will get the recording, and thank you much for joining us. Have a great day, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.
Thank you.